Good morning. I'm KP Gore-Chapel, Executive Director for Baptist Women in Ministry of North Carolina. Today's webinar is how to best choose a post-grad divinity degree. And we have representatives, presenters, who will be speaking to that question, specifically looking at the way or guidelines that people have made those choices in the past and in the present. But also how the landscape might be changing and how the pandemic and the life that we live today has changed church and needs and goals. So each presenter will speak to a particular topic. We'll take about 3 to 5 minutes to make that presentation. Christy Hollyfield, who is a graduate of Gardner-Webb School of Divinity and former minister with children and their families at First Baptist Church Marion. And she is the woman that asked the initial question to get us going on this webinar as a need, as she's searching for the best choice for her in postgraduate studies. So this morning we begin with Heather Folliard. Heather is going to tell her story. She is in the midst of her DMin journey. And Heather, introduce yourself as co-pastor of Jubilee and tell us your story.
Thank you so much, Kathy and everybody. I'm Heather Folliard. I am an MDiv graduate from Duke Divinity School from the Baptist House of Studies, and am co-pastor of Jubilee Baptist Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and am currently a candidate for the Doctor of Ministry degree at Campbell University Divinity School. I've really pondered what to share with everybody today, but would like to just say this to begin: no doctoral degree is for the faint of heart. That said, there are different demands for each. And I have friends who have either been a THD, a PhD, or DMin, but I haven't engaged in any but the DMin. So I'm going to stick to what I know. I do know, in looking for the place to enter this degree, that different schools, different programs have differing foci or emphases, like prophetic writing or speaking, spirituality or social justice. Not all schools have specific foci, but some do, and that is something to look at. Second of all, with the DMin, it is context driven. You are going to be researching a topic that has arisen or you will devise in your ministry context. So while you will be doing adequate biblical study, you're going to be engaging theologians and historians in a deep, scholarly, academic, critical way. So there's still that, but you are going to be centering that for your work in your particular context. So that's the biggest difference in the terms of subject matter. I would encourage you, just as you would apply to a PhD program or a THD based on the scholarship of someone there at the institution that you're looking at, you should do the same for a DMin. As a recent MDiv grad, you might want to spend some more time in a ministry context, developing your pastoral identity before seeking a doctorate of ministry. That might be the same for a PhD or a THD, but I think that the context is more specific for the Doctor of Ministry. That is my experience, and I'm happy to answer questions later, but didn't want to overstep what I do know just about the Doctor of Ministry, specifically at Campbell in North Carolina.
Heather, thank you. Thank you. And it's been a privilege of mine to work with Heather in worship planning for CBFNC annual gatherings. And those are intense times. And I so appreciate the journey that Heather has been on in many areas. Christy Hollyfield, as I said, is co-host. Christy has an unusual background as she comes to us through marketing, through business degree and work, and then theology, and that now is looking for the future. So Christy, bring us up to date a little bit on your story and why you asked the question that you did that got us into this webinar.
Will do. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. Kathy and I were talking right at the beginning of the year. I decided to step away from First Baptist Marion as the minister with part-time minister with children and families to better discern what it was I was interested in doing, where my calling truly was, and what type of degree I wanted to continue on, if it was the DMin or if it was a PhD program. And we were talking and I said, you know, I have so many questions about just kind of navigating that field. It would be wonderful to be able to have some resources of folks who have been there, done that, why they chose the route they chose, and their personal experiences. And as we were gathering and kind of coming together with this group of individuals, more and more questions have come about. It's caused me to do more internal reflection, which is always a wonderful thing, and really look at, as Heather mentioned earlier, the type of minister that I am and that I know that I do really well at. And so I appreciate everyone being here today. I know I'm not alone in this search. Several friends of mine, when I was at Gardner-Webb University in that last year of transition from getting ready to graduate, there were a lot of us trying to kind of sort through this. How do we know which is the best route for us? And I'm thankful that we have individuals who are willing to share their information and help guide us through this path. So thank you very much for being here today. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Christy, very much. Our first presenter of our guest presenters is Curtis Freeman, and Curtis is the director of the Baptist House of Studies at Duke Divinity. And when I invited, and I did want to mention this, every person that I invited to be part of this webinar said yes. So I am so thankful to you for being willing to be part of this conversation today. And Curtis responded, now I have some definite ideas and there are no gray areas. Is that okay? And I went, yes, we want to hear it. Yeah. So we start with Curtis, where the, not necessarily boundaries, but where the framework has been in the past and for some schools are today. This is exciting to have Curtis here. So Curtis, the areas of distinction to consider in search for a post-grad divinity degrees. Please speak to us.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everybody for being here and inviting me to be a part of this conversation. It's an important one. I think the first question that has already been sort of addressed that I would ask, and I think it's an important one anytime, is to say, should I? It isn't like which degree, but actually should I? And Heather's kind of spoken to that one. And I think that's the sort of question we need to ask. Why do I need another degree? I mean, is there something deficient in my MDiv work that is not equipping me to do the work that I want to do? What is the end to which I would want this further education? So the two that you've laid out are sort of two tracks. One is the DMin, the other is that you said the THD or PhD, which are sort of related in important ways. One is, and I think it's already been alluded to, that the DMin is an applied research track, whereas the other is what we might call discovery research. So if you are really wanting to gain greater proficiency in ministry, the DMin is where you want to go. I would just say anybody that's pursuing ministry and that's your aim, I would just say it would be a unicorn to say you should do the PhD or THD. Right now, Duke, which is one of the top PhD programs in religion in the country, has reduced our numbers down. This year, we're accepting only 5 people into our doctoral program. I mean, they're very narrow, they're very focused. We have, usually about 200 applicants for those 5 slots. And And if you look at the numbers of women in those programs, it's a little less than 50% nationwide in those research programs. But the other thing about the THD and PhD is that these are really intensive, and you're going to spend probably 6 to 8 years finishing those degrees before you're back into the workforce. So you're actually going to be postponing that that ability to gain income. And these days, everybody is thinking about indebtedness and all of that. That's not to discourage people, women that are, I would just say that oftentimes the brightest students that I have advised, worked with, taught have been the women students. And I'm looking at some of the really gifted, bright people in our Baptist life. But I mean, if you really are interested in teaching and research and then I would say pursue it. I do think that there is right now, it's different than when Linda and I were doing this work. The graduate work that was being done then is now it's so focused on very narrow research areas, and those really, the formation that we're doing now in graduate programs around the country in religion, there's really not, it doesn't equip people with the kinds of skills and habits that pastors need. So I really, it's not that I'm negative. I teach in these graduate programs. I'm a convener of one of our tracks in our PhD and THD programs, but I don't think it's a really good fit for people that are headed towards a ministry. I teach in a DMin program, and I love it. I think they are some of the most exciting, wonderful people with brilliant ideas, and the work that they're doing is so important. And I have been greatly enriched by the students that I've worked with. So I think that I don't think that there's anything that a DMin program you shouldn't be thinking that, like, if I really want to do my best, I got to do a PhD or a THD. DMin programs can be really wonderful, and they do great work. So let me stop there.
Well, and that is a perfect transition. That is a perfect transition to Linda McKinnish Bridges and looking at the changing landscape. Linda is going to talk with us about the degree search or certificate alternatives for women becoming bi-professional. And Ursula Harrison is having difficulty getting in, and I'm going to take care of that while Linda presents for us. And then Christy, if you will do the honors of introducing Steve Harmon, but I'll get Ursula in here as well. Linda, so thank you for being here today.
This is one of those moments, and some would say rare moments, when I really would like to be silent and listen rather than speak. Kind of a rare moment, but because you represent the current and future world, and I belong to a space and time. Curtis put us in that wonderful time period slot where things were a little different, and so I risk speaking at being lodged in that place and not being lodged where you are. But let me speak for just a moment on the general idea of making decisions, because I think in my own experience, that's been a really interesting one. And if I can offer any kind of thinking that might be beneficial to you, is how do you go about making that decision? There's certainly the heart, what it is that God wants me to do. And I must confess that I have been guilty of going out into the backyard and looking at the cloud formation for that YES or that NO response to that. I don't recommend that necessarily for something like a DMin or a PhD decision. Curtis has already said it. This is a tremendous investment of both time, money, your family responsibilities, current, and that which you plan in the future. This is a big decision. You might not just want to relegate it to the cloud formation on a sunny afternoon or not so sunny afternoon. So those decision-making apparatus are really important. Some of it is statistics, how many women are in the DMin, how many women are in the PhD. So Curtis has already alluded to that, and maybe we can pull together some of those numbers if that's something of interest to you. For me, I wasn't thinking so much back in the day of outcomes, because I was thinking, and maybe in a bit arrogant kind of way, that I can break through the misogyny of the Baptist ecclesiastical tradition. That was kind of a big wad to try to think I could do, but probably it's a little bit of youth, a little bit of naivete, and a lot of hope and energy that I had then, thinking that I would be an outlier in that misogynist framework of the Baptist tradition. So as you make these decisions, it's a heart and a mind kind of moment as you look at all those elements, but don't forget to look at the outcome element. How many jobs? And in many ways, we kind of relegate this to the bottom, thinking, well, God's chosen me to do this, I will do this, and there will be a way. I must confess that was my thought in the very beginning as a 21-year-older breaking through the hard, the ceiling, the stained glass ceiling of the Baptist denomination. But now I would want someone to tell me what I would like to tell you, that there are some myths to this, and think of it in terms of busting some of those myths. If I could give you that gift, as I had hoped someone might have given me that gift when I was where you are in determining, first of all, to tell you that I've gone through all the degrees, as our Baptist comedian used to say, I'm educated beyond my intelligence. So there's an MRE on the back side of my name. There's an MDiv on the back side of my name, because they wouldn't allow me to do an MDiv when I did the MRE, because women couldn't study theology and Greek at the time. So I went through the MRE, I went through the MDiv, and then I went for a PhD, and then I ended up with an MBA. So got a lot of those suffixes, right? I was wife to husband Tilden, who did the MDiv and then went to do an MRE and then did the DMin. So in our family household, we've got the PhD understanding and we've got the DMin understanding. When we first started Baptist Theological Seminary in Richmond, after year number 3, Dr. Dan Bagby, some of you who know Dan, said we need a DMin, and it was a wonderful program for Baptist Theological Seminary Richmond. I saw the effect of that program throughout Virginia, and the strengthening of the churches and strengthening of the ministers. So I've got some of that understanding, but I want to speak to you as I would have hoped someone would have spoken to me. If you think this suffix beside your name, either PhD or DMin, will erode misogyny in Baptist or ecclesiastical life, not. If you think this suffix at the end of your name will give you as a woman more opportunities in ecclesiastical life in the current moment of misogyny, not. If you think that this will give you a deep, ultimate understanding of whatever world problem that you're trying to solve, not. Curtis has already alluded to it. There is a limit to even the deepest philosophical, ideological position of any study, and it is a pattern course of study decided with a particular ideological position, so you cannot depend on that for that happening. What will it do? It will increase your knowledge. So if you are not wedded to outcome, but you are really interested in increasing your knowledge, it will be something to help you. It will also help you to understand yourself better. It will build a network of friendships. It will create a web of understanding. And as someone said on a Facebook post just a few days ago, it was one of our Baptist sisters, said, what point in your construction of your theological system did you begin to deconstruct? And it's kind of hard for me to have to tell you that the point of deconstruction is almost as valuable as construction. So if that world of knowledge will enable you to be able to understand theological world, ecclesiastical world better, then it is worth every moment of your time. But be considerate and concerned about the outcomes and be able to delineate that outcome that you're looking for so that you're not disappointed. I'm sure my time is about up.
Your
So
time, I was just gonna
I'm through.
jump right in there.
I'm through.
Linda, thank
So
you.
you are so welcome.
Thank
It's
you.
so good to be with you. And to your fearless leader, I just offer all of my admiration and support. Carry on, my sisters.
This is so wonderful to have you all gathered today. Linda, thank you for that. And that was a good segue from Curtis to Linda. And then I'm going to let hopefully Ursel catch his breath, and then Christy's going to introduce Steve. But Ursel is adjunct professor at Central Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas, and is a member at First Baptist Murfreesboro, Tennessee, also a coach with Pinnacle Coaching. And I have to give this little commercial. I had not gotten a D-Min all these years. I knew D-Min would be what I wanted in my life, but I had not found one in all these years that really made me think that I wanted to invest the time that all of you have described. Until one day, Ursel Harrison, and I was over 65 when this email occurred, he sent an email asking me to help market a new D-Min being offered at Central Seminary. And it was a D-Min in creative leadership with an entrepreneurial spirit. And when I read that, I wrote Ursel back immediately and said, how about me? He said, call me right now. I think that was in October. I had an interview by November, and I started in January, and I graduated last May 2020. And that has been so helpful, that degree, at this time in my life, as I have reconnected, re-envisioned with the changing world, and then work with Baptist Women in Ministry almost as a new start for our religious nonprofit. So I say that to welcome Ursel, because he has an interesting piece about his church, D-Min versus PhD, changing landscape. Ursel, speak to us about 3 to 5 minutes.
Great, thank you, Kathy, and sorry I've missed the discussion up to this point. Kathy asked me to talk about the local church context, and actually I can speak to this in a very personal way because for the past year, I was on a pastor search committee for our church and was vice chair of that committee. And we began our process, and then of course ran into COVID and stopped for a while, but then picked it up again and actually did a virtual call weekend and called a pastor. In that process, we interviewed 10 different people for the role of pastor of our congregation. And interestingly enough, for the first time in 75 years, we have a pastor who does not have either a THD or a PhD. Our new pastor has a doctor of ministry degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in pastoral care. And I think this says something about the shift in the how local churches look at academic degrees. It was interesting. We had 10 candidates, 5 had the D-Min, 1 was working on a final project, 2 had just enrolled in doctor of ministry programs, and 2 had the Master of Divinity. And one of the things that I did as part of the committee was really develop kind of a Cliff's Notes piece for people to understand what are theological degrees, what are the different theological degrees. Our folks had no idea. And these are educated folks. Most of them were college graduates and had been involved in the church for a number of years. But when it came down to talking about the Master of Divinity, Doctor of Ministry, PhD, they had no idea and could not differentiate between these different types of degrees. And what I found as we were working on this was that what they really leaned more toward was skills and competencies than degrees. And I think this is reflected in what's been happening in theological education for the last several years. Increasingly, there are fewer people pursuing the Master of Divinity degree and more people pursuing Master of Arts in whatever, or a Master of Theology degree. Might be in leadership, missional studies, pastoral care, but the emphasis is more on the competencies the person learns rather than a theological degree. So this is a particular shift, and we're seeing with doctor of ministry and PhD programs, the percentage increase in people involved in PhD programs in the last 5 years, according to ATS, about a 2% increase. For doctor of ministry degrees, a 4% increase. So, we're moving in the same direction as those MDiv and MA programs are as well. It's an interesting time for us, and I think it's a challenge for those folks who are involved in academia, because it feels like what we are doing is not as important for some people. They're looking more for the finished product than they are for the theological education that is involved in our institutions. I guess 3 quick observations I would make about the situation we find ourselves in now. That although there's a certain amount of prestige related to having a doctorate degree of some type, churches are looking more at skills and competencies than anything else. For good or ill, degrees are much more important to people in academia than they are to people in the churches. And I think the third thing I would say to anybody who is considering advanced theological training would be, follow your passion. Where do you see the need in your particular ministry? What is the thing that really excites you about ministry? And where do you need to increase your ability and competency? It may be a doctor of ministry degree, and there's some wonderful doctor of ministry degrees out there in various areas, and look across the country at possibilities. The one that we do at Central Seminaries is one, in creative leadership. But if someone approached me and said, I'm really interested in becoming a better preacher, I would say, you need to look somewhere else. Or if you have an emphasis in pastoral care, look for that. I think we're also seeing more opportunities for certificate kind of programs that will help people develop skills in specific areas of ministry. So we're in a state of flux right now. And speaking from a local church perspective, I really think people in the pew are looking more for effectiveness on the part of the minister rather than the degree at this particular point.
Thank you, Ursula. I appreciate that comment. Steve Harmon, who is a professor at Gardner-Webb University, he and I spoke yesterday in regards to just gaining more knowledge about this whole process. And he spoke in more detail about how, again, the landscape is changing for students in the potentially looking more at bivocational cultures. Steve, would you please continue that conversation, speak more to that, and add additional information you feel pertinent?
Thanks, Christy, for the introduction, and Kathy for putting this together, and everybody who has preceded me with the very helpful perspectives you've shared. I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but I will frame this in terms of Christy and others have mentioned a bivocational, or Jay Keevy, who coordinates Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of South Carolina, has recently suggested in a conversation with our students at Gardner-Webb that a better term for this may be biprofessional. We have one vocation, one calling, but it may be lived out in an increasingly biprofessional context. So when I use the term bivocational, that's the kind of thing I have in mind. In the theological education or theological integration capstone seminar that I teach, in which Dr. Keevy spoke recently, we have a session toward the end of the course where we do some brainstorming, envisioning together about the future of ministry. And a major component of that discussion is invariably the increasingly bivocational or biprofessional future of ministry. We're all familiar with the factors in church life and its relationship to the broader culture that are pointing to that trend. I also want to make clear to anyone who thinks they might want to be a theological educator one day, that they need to know that theological education as a ministry is likely to be increasingly bivocational or biprofessional as well. Not only is the church trending in that direction, institutions of theological education are contracting in some ways rather than expanding. Some are merging. Some, sadly, are closing. There will not be nearly as many full-time tenure-track faculty appointments in the future for anyone thinking that they want to be a professional theological educator. And so that means that when I've had conversations with students who have that kind of interest, I have tried to talk them out of it, talk them out of doing a PhD or a THD, unless they are really passionate about that and really have a sense of calling in that direction and have a sense of self in which they know that what really energizes them are things like reading and studying and writing. I want people thinking about these possibilities to know that the life of a PhD student, a THD student, is one that's not so much about relationships with people all the time and actively engaged in the practice of ministry, but it's about reading and studying and writing. And if you're someone who would not be happy doing this for hours or days or years at a time, that's not what you need to do with your time and life. However, if you're a person who's put together in that way, and you're also passionate about the ministry of the church and want to serve the church as a theological educator, then by all means, pursue this with the understanding that the manner in which you practice a ministry of theological education on behalf of the church may in fact involve serving in a local church setting or some other expression of a place of ministry. And it may also involve teaching adjunctively in a college, a university, a seminary, a divinity school. There are going to be many opportunities to serve as a theological educator in that way. And a doctorate of ministry is a very fine preparation for serving as a local church theologian, which is one of the tasks of ministry. You are a theologian in residence in your ministry setting. I would like to argue that the MDiv serves as a good preparation for serving as a theologian in residence in your place of ministry, but in ways that others have already gestured toward. A doctorate of ministry program can strengthen your preparation for that, fill in some gaps in your previous theological education, and prepare you to match those filled in gaps with the kinds of things you're interested in doing in ministry. Some of my most enjoyable experiences as a theological educator have been working with doctorate of ministry students who are working in a place of ministry. And when we're having conversations about what's going on there and intentionally framing these practices of ministry theologically, I have the sense that I have an even more direct connection to what's going on in the life of the church when I'm working with my doctorate of ministry students. So I would encourage that interest if you have it. I'll go ahead and yield the floor or the screen to others who may speak.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. And what I'm hearing is how we help people prepare to make these decisions, that instead of just helping people make a decision as they're about to embark on this post-grad search, that we really back it up and start having these conversations when they're in college, and in the early days of divinity school. And so, Steve, I appreciate your comments. And Dr. Jennifer Garcia Bashaw is here with us today, and she brings that perspective as well. Jennifer, would you introduce yourself and give us your title at Campbell? That would be helpful.
Sure, no problem. So I teach in the undergraduate department of Christian Studies, and I am the assistant professor of New Testament and Christian ministry. So I teach the ministry courses here and some of the New Testament as well. And Steve said so much of what I was going to say that I'm going to adapt my message a bit so that I can tell you what I think would be really helpful for people who are considering degrees, especially if you have connections with your undergraduate program and your professors. I think the best resources that we can give to students is to share our experiences with them. And so that's what we tend to do in our department and also in the Office of Spiritual Life here at Campbell. We tell our stories and so they can get to know who we are and how we chose what we did. Maybe if there are some regrets that we have or some encouragement that we have, we can give it to them. And having said that, I'll tell you a little bit about my story because I do have a PhD in theology and New Testament, but I've always felt called to the church as well. My main gifting, I think, is in teaching. And so in order for me to teach in a university, I had to get a PhD, but I almost did not survive my PhD program because I'm an extrovert. So what Steve was saying is 100% correct. You have to know yourself. You have to know your personality and where you're going and what you want to do. I do not regret getting my PhD. However, I would not have survived if I hadn't been in ministry at the same time. I was also serving in a church. And also I was not at a top tier school. I was not at a Duke or at a Princeton. I was at Fuller Theological Seminary. And because of that, I was able to, the programs are a little less competitive. You can do other things like have children and serve in a church at the same time. And so I think that's how it worked out for me. And so I think it's really important to consider all of the elements in your life, to talk to many different kinds of people who have personalities like you and maybe who have personalities that aren't like you, so that you can gather all the information that you might need to make decisions, not just about whether you're going to do a PhD or a DMin, but where you might do that, what kind of institution would be a good fit for you, what kind of program would be a good fit for you. So that's why I think it's really important for you to just speak to as many people as possible. And one last thing I want to say is if you do want to teach part-time adjunctively, then you can do that with the DMin, depending on what school you would teach at. We at the Divinity School here at Campbell employ people who teach with DMins. I would just say you need to focus on that early on, maybe more research oriented that can help you if you're going to focus in a particular area like spiritual formation or something, that it will be easier for you to teach in that area later on. So I think that's all I wanted to say, even though Steve stole about half the things I was going to say. No. Thank you so much for letting me share.
Thank you, Jennifer. Christy?
Thank you, Jennifer. Lynn Brinkley is our next speaker. And Lynn, I noticed so many times your hand was raising as Linda was speaking as well. I would love to hear more about those responses, those hand waves, and if you could also speak to us more about the degree search for women of color as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christy, and my sister Kathy. Thank you, and thank you so much for your leadership for Baptist women in North Carolina. But my journey, I did the DMin route. Steve Harmon was my professor at Campbell, and I was under him and saw his passion. And I said, I can't do that. I can't. I don't, like you said, I didn't have the energy, the time for the study. I'm like Jennifer, Dr. Harmon, I wanted to do ministry and also go meet famous people. So I went with the doctorate of ministry degree. And with my decision process, what I tell students that I counsel today who are wrestling with these decisions, the number one question, and Curtis Freeman alluded to it earlier, what is your ultimate goal? Why do you want this degree? And for me at the time, I was serving, I was in a unique position as a woman of color working at a divinity school in a leadership position. And I felt like a DMin would enhance my opportunities at Campbell University. And it did. I ended up being an adjunct professor, and I still am. And I get to work with Jennifer Pushaw in the Christian Studies department at Campbell. So pursuing the DMin helped me tremendously, but I already had a foot in the door at Campbell. I was a graduate of the school. I knew the professors. And when I decided to do my DMin, I did want to do it at a different university, just, out of respect for my colleagues, but also, to be a little bit rebellious. And I actually wanted to attend Drew University. And another wise decision you have to consider when you pursue, especially if you're bivocational, does this program work with my current career position? Can I juggle both? And there was no way I could keep my job at Campbell and attend Drew University. And so I explored Gordon Conwell in Boston, in Massachusetts. And it was extremely different university context. And I was accepted. My professor was Haddon Robinson, and I was a part of the last class he ever taught in his life at Gordon Conwell. And I was in a cohort of 16 men and me. And so in that cohort, there were men who were in that room that did not feel I should have been in that room. And I also had to struggle more financially because they could share rooms with each other. Because they were men, they could, have 3 or 4 in a campus dorm. Because I was the only woman, I had to pay the 3 weeks of time at a hotel in Boston on my own dime by myself. So I didn't have a roommate. And it was ironic that, especially for the guys who felt like, women shouldn't be in leadership positions, they shouldn't be preaching. But when assignments were due, or when there were things that needed explaining, or, they would come to me and ask me, what is the assignment? What do we have to do? When is this due? So I ended up being probably in their minds the secretary for the cohort, but keeping everybody on task. And out of those, there were 17 of us, and graduation, there were 4 who graduated, and I was one of the 4. I don't know if they ever finished, but it just goes to show, I think that's why my hands were amening Linda, because of all of the misogyny, the patriarchy. And then I look at, my story of how I was viewed as not being worthy to be in the room, but I finished the race before several of those men. But I will say that several of them did come up to me and acknowledge some of the patriarchal views they had had. They affirmed my call to preach. There were times that Haddon Robinson would even pull me aside and say, he would call me Carol. Carol, are these guys treating you well? Do you feel like you have a voice? I appreciate his willingness to make sure that my voice was heard. Now, the Lynn today would certainly approach a postgraduate degree a lot differently. Number one, and I say this all the time, I have graduated from 4 universities and not one was an HBCU. And I deeply regret that. I deeply regret that I did not attend a historically Black college and university, because now more than ever, I realize how important that framework would have shaped my life and my ministry. And so as I counsel, particularly women of color now, and I think this trend is you're going to see a lot of this where people of color are going to be more interested in exploring theological postgraduate education at HBCUs. And I also say, make wise decisions, think about the time, the investment. Accreditation is very important, and especially considering what you want to do with your degree. You have to be careful where you pursue your postgraduate degree and the accreditation those type of schools offer. And then as a woman of color in this season, we have to consider the trifecta, the pandemic, the racial injustice that's happening right now, economic insecurity that tends to, all of those impact people that look like me greater. And all of that is going to play a part in, can I realistically, professionally, personally, financially invest in a doctorate of ministry degree, knowing that when I graduate, the opportunities for me are few and far between. Like I said, I've been fortunate because I had a foot in the door, but there's so many women, particularly women of color, who don't have that foot in the door. And so I would say you have to do, if you're seriously considering postgraduate education, my questions would be different today. I would certainly, and honestly, now I want to see more diversity in the faculty. I want to see curriculum and syllabi. I needed to learn about James Cone and Andrina Lee. I needed to learn about critical race theory and Black liberation theology. I needed to know about womanist theology and Katie Cannon. I didn't learn those things in my theological degree. And not only do I need to learn them, but non-African American students need to learn those things. I needed to know the history of the Black church. I mean, there were, and I won't say there were no conversations, but it wasn't in-depth conversations. As a matter of fact, speaking of the history of the Black church, if you're not aware of the PBS series on the Black church, will be next Tuesday and Wednesday, I believe, on PBS at 9:00. And I highly recommend you tune in and encourage your colleagues and students to watch that. But I think, I'm thankful that a lot of institutions have spoke out against Black Lives Matter. But now what is being done to back up those statements? What are we doing on our faculty, even in terms of even considering students of color in graduate positions and teachers' assistants, things of those nature. So I'm going to stop there.
Friends, this has been rich. What I would like to invite you to do is after, I will send a recording to all of you panelists, of course. And if there are follow-up comments that we could incorporate into our social media or on our website that would support the presentations today, I think that would be helpful. I do want to ask Christy, do you feel like your questions have been answered in the conversation that you and I had several weeks ago about how do we search and what do we need to consider? I have learned so much today. So I hope this has been helpful for someone like you who is searching for those answers.
It has been wonderful. I thank each of you so very much for your insight, your wisdom, the information that you've shared about your personal journeys, things that you wish someone had told you now that you have learned. It has been just a wonderful, wonderful webinar. I have got so much more now to sit and process and do some more internal note-taking and thinking about what direction I want to go into. Is this really something that I want to invest this time in? it has just been an awesome experience. And I think that others that have the opportunity to come back and watch this webinar will feel just as the same as I do. They will feel very, very grateful for the information and that's been shared. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Christy. And just a word, Baptist Women in Ministry of North Carolina, our mission is telling stories, opening doors, and building community. And you have helped us achieve our mission today with this webinar. And we are very excited to have this opportunity to connect with you and to learn from you. So thank you for this today.
Thank you.
Thank you.